Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Higgins, Research Director with Longhuas. Joining me on this episode of The Advisor is cuneyt Uysal, Product Manager with OpenText for Asia Pacific. Hi cuneyt, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Before we look specifically at the evolving applications landscape in Australia, can you share with us a little bit about OpenText and in particular your area of the company?
Absolutely. So OpenText is a Canadian-based company. It's actually the largest software vendor in Canada.
Yep.
And so we are the preeminent or the largest vendor of enterprise content management software. And so what that means is we do about $1 billion in revenue per year,
Yep.
about 5,000 employees. We're probably the largest software vendor you guys haven't heard about. And for that, one of those reasons is we spend a lot of time in the background of companies, but now
Yep.
today we're having a much more public-facing role as we manage things like web content, social media, and digital assets. So you'll be hearing a lot more about us.
First of all, you've talked about that trend of the old CMS versus the new CMS.
Yeah.
So obviously older CMSs would have been primarily just about managing basic HTML, I assume.
Right.
And you touched on things like digital content, user-generated content.
That's right.
How much interest is there in Australia around some of that? And are there any particular industries that you've found are more interested in things like user-generated and sort of more, I suppose, higher-end digital assets, you know, video and
Right.
and audio, that type of thing?
That's a good question. So our research shows that in trend with a lot of technology trends, the growth is a little bit slower here than behind North America. So it's almost a 1-year lag as opposed to 2, as we've seen in others. So Australia is quite advanced when it comes to using tools like social media. I would say that the marketers are still driving the adoption of social media. Right now, there's still a bit of a disconnect between, say, the marketing team and the IT groups in terms of how they acquire, purchase, and use these kind of assets. But we're seeing that come together. Platforms like ours allow us to use a standard platform that doesn't have 3 different departments using different wikis and blogs and podcasts, so we can kind of make a more CIO-centric approach to how you approach these new tools. But I would say the marketers are still leading the jump. And I would say as far as specific industries and specific regions, you would see that mostly telcos are using it quite a bit. I know Telstra has quite a few social media initiatives that some of our partners have developed, as well as I would say media organizations or broadcasters. They tend to be the big drivers around these technological innovations.
And what about, you know, we've seen a lot of press lately around managing the interactions between government and citizens, and particularly some of that social media, you know, the Gov 2.0 initiative that's been ongoing,
That's right.
recent policy announcements by Department of Finance and Deregulation through AGIMO around social media.
That's right.
What's the sort of interest and maybe some of the landscape from your perspective inside the public sector? You know, were they heavily invested in traditional CMSs? Are they looking at some of these new digital media strategies and having to manage that content?
Well, it's interesting. I see few trends. One of which is the perspective that there are some organizations who perhaps were laggards in what we call traditional web content management, just the boring stuff of creating, reading, and updating content.
Yep.
They're almost making a leap forward into using social media because it's popular, because it's seen as something that is new, and it's a good way to seen as being reactive and supportive of the community at large. But I think in government initiatives, it's still taking time. We do have active opportunities that we're seeing from the field come in that are related to forums, but I still think as far as like really deep social networking or blogs or wikis, it's still going to take time. I think people are still going from that perspective that it's an online discussion forum. They still have to mature their understanding of what full-blown social networking is. But another interesting trend is how we're seeing that with the increased use of social media in organizations, both private and public, that there comes a risk that has to be balanced with, say, the candy of using, those Web 2.0 tools. And so in an enterprise, OpenText would comically say that we are the aspirin to some of those pains. Yep. And so we balance those concerns by providing what we call a bit of a compliance and security around social media. So we have tools in place and check to, look through in an automated fashion, see if the discussion has the right tone, the right sentiment, see if it's really a positive discussion or if it's something just purely negative and spam.
Yeah. We've touched on this a little bit, but we do seem obsessed within the local market about, and the industry as a whole, about legacy applications within our portfolio. What is your experience in relation to the legacy software in Australian organisations? Do you think there's a lot of legacy out there? Is it a real problem? What are your thoughts in terms of the broader legacy application issue?
Yeah, I don't think it's an issue. I think in certain markets like financial, they're tied to a lot of trading applications and trading platforms that are never going to go away, frankly.
Yep.
So I think that's
Stuck
a
with them.
specific subset in finance.
Yeah.
But given that, I think that being a data person, I think that there's lots of opportunities as well. I think that organizations always have challenges rationalizing this legacy data, whether it's an issue of they decommission these systems or whether they actually move on to a new platform. In reality, and what we found in having to do a lot of these projects, OpenText, we call ourselves the Switzerland of software vendors. We have very strong relationships in how we tie systems that are, say, master data in SAP and how you tie that with information in Oracle. Or say, SharePoint documents. And so we sit as this neutral zone, this neutral territory that acts as a bridge between all these different systems. And that allows someone who is an enterprise architect to have a migration path for how you'd like to decommission a legacy application. We have something called the OpenText Integration Center. And what that actually does is it actually allows you to not only do some transformations and migrate data into a new system, but also allows you to keep the legacy system online. And so that allows for a migration strategy. And sometimes we don't actually ever decommission the old system because it works fine and you have this synchronous pipe from the new to the old system.
Increasingly, we're being asked by organisations about the appropriate use of Microsoft SharePoint. And that's one area where we see a lot of integration happening, a lot of integration being done.
Right.
Our view is that, like many of Microsoft's products, we believe SharePoint is very much a platform. It's not, as you described, finished, for want of a better description. As Microsoft-oriented organisations look at their application portfolio and begin the renewal, how would you recommend that they should position SharePoint in say, their ECM strategies?
Right. That's a very good topic. As I mentioned before, OpenText has a long-standing relationship with Microsoft. So there's actually websites around that. It's called Microsoft Better Together. It's a campaign that OpenText and Microsoft do jointly. And the reason for that is because OpenText has been kind of a unstructured content advisor to several companies, as we mentioned before, Oracle, SAP, and Microsoft. So in the development of SharePoint itself, OpenText was invited into the TAP program, the Technical Advisory Program, where we actually have access to co-develop parts of SharePoint with Microsoft.
Right, okay.
And so we have employees that sit in Redmond as advisories into how the two can work together to make better products. And so what we have seen is that, and the shared knowledge around where OpenText and Microsoft sit in the space, because from a marketing perspective, they do very similar things. The SharePoint wheel looks a lot like the ECM Vision, and hits upon the same marketing buzz terms. But we found, obviously, and I think what you've demonstrated as well through research, is that SharePoint's it's a great user interface. It's really captivated people in the sense that it's a big improvement over SharePoint 2003.
Yeah.
In 2010, again, going to improve upon those interface perspectives. But again, from an architecture perspective, it's a 3-year-old product. It hasn't been around as long as, say, some other ECM vendors have. And so we're seeing that absolutely it is a platform. It's a platform for development, but it gives you a great head start, say, from nothing. And so I think to realize that there is going to be a bit of services and consulting and best practices involved in how you technically craft an end solution that is finished, as well as second is looking at SharePoint governance.
So in simple terms then, does that mean that I have two choices? I can go out and purchase potentially as an organisation a complete ECM stack, from maybe the traditional side of the OpenText business.
Yep.
Or I can choose to standardise on something like a SharePoint as a platform, because I'm going to use SharePoint for a bunch of different things, and then effectively it becomes the engine for what is effectively the same outcome as the traditional ECM solutions, but provides the front end and the back end elements of the old stack.
That's right.
Okay.
And I think what's interesting about SharePoint from a marketing perspective is that it's a portal and it's middleware, but they never call it those terms.
Yeah.
They call it in terms of what it delivers. What is the solution? Instead of, I don't think the terms portal or middleware resonate with business managers outside the IT realm.
That's right. Yeah, they want to hear collaboration, document management.
They want to hear search. They want to hear those terms they know and understand.
And as you said before, if it's a portal, then chances are it's going to be skinny on the content. So you've got to get the content managed and get it from somewhere. And if it's middleware, then chances are, as we said again before, it's not completely finished. So it won't have the interfaces built to do some of the administrative activities or integration with Outlook and some of these other things that might be necessary in a content management process.
That's right.
No, very important. Cuneyt, in 2007, Longhouse predicted that the open source movement, so very, very much, I suppose, the open source guys are wearing the red shirts like they're doing in Thailand at the moment and beating down doors of enterprises all over the world. We predicted that the open source movement would transform and that open source would just become a part of the normal software market by 2012.
Right.
There's obviously only a couple of years to go. From your perspective, how would you describe the role of open source and associated solutions within the ECM market from your perspective?
Right. It's a very good question. We obviously see open source in various number of opportunities where we're competing against them.
Yep.
But at the same time, I think what open source has done is has helped drive the awareness of the need for ECM. I think when something hits the open source markets, it's showing that there is a great deal of attention and attraction to that kind of software. So it's a validation of the space to a degree. And as well, it also helps drive open standards.
Okay.
So although OpenText doesn't have a policy on open sourcing any of our libraries right now, we do have developer communities in the OpenText developer network where you can actually develop plugins freely, things like that to that degree.
Yep.
One of the things
And so those developers could choose if they wanted to make their plugins open source, obviously. Yep.
Exactly. Yep.
Yep.
And so we have something that we do have quite a presence on open advisory boards as well. So OpenText does sit in those boards. Staff of ours have also been quite heavily involved in the JSR standards for the Java portless specifications, as well as around CMIS, which is the platform for open content management interchange between various different systems. And so, the OpenText content server and the archiving server does adhere to those standards. So if you do have a third-party system that is open source, we can communicate quite freely with that system as well.
Okay. So in terms of standards more broadly, you mentioned there the content management interface and interchange standard. What other standards should people keep in mind when they're renewing their application portfolios and looking to employ content management functionality, search functionality, records management functionality? Any sort of key standards that enterprise architects and lead developers should be aware of?
Yeah, well, I think XML has been quite pervasive, but building upon that is that the modern realm of consumer technology, which is quite so popular today in the web, it's all founded upon REST or REST technology. And so, if your vendor isn't looking in that direction, if don't have those interfaces, they're perhaps a little bit behind the ball game.
Yep.
And the reason for that approach is because HTML is becoming the lingua franca for all kind of interfaces, whether it's traditional HTML or newer versions of HTML5, you'll see that a lot of the innovation that's going on is in the user interfaces and the front ends of solutions.
Yep.
And so by having that REST interface, you're allowing someone who's not necessarily a software engineer, but more of a web front-end developer to leverage your systems and to have access to them to build widgets like Adobe Air apps or Flash or interactive services that is something that perhaps an enterprise won't get to on their own. And they can use a different type of skill set and resource to do that that's much more creative and much more interactive.
Yeah. So in terms of an evaluation criteria, then it sounds like the CMIS and ensuring that it can communicate with my CMS via a REST protocol are the two big criteria to put in any assessment.
I would, absolutely.
Lastly then, if you could only give organisations who are about to go through their application renewal cycle one tip to help them better define their modern application agenda, what would that tip be?
Okay, it's a tough one, but I think I'm going to have to point to mobility and the use of mobile technology.
Right.
So OpenText and a lot of organizations have been looking into the rapid growth and proliferation of mobile technology.
Yep.
Essentially pointing to the fact that by around 2015, depending who you talk to, the mobile phone is going to be the primary connection device to the internet worldwide.
Yep.
And so it's grown faster than desktop, and it's grown faster than traditional internet connectivity, about 3 times as fast from what we've seen. And especially mobile social networking, so people using things like Facebook or LinkedIn on their phones, has grown 3 times faster than that. I think the last factoid that we saw was, in my research, was that the total online population of people using mobile social networking technologies today is the size of the United States. So 370 million people using tools like Facebook or Bebo or QQ, depending what region you're in. Yeah. And that's just amazing. That's just pointing to the next generation of information worker and what they're going to expect. And so OpenText has dived into that realm. We have a product called OpenText Everywhere, which allows you to access all of our ECM systems, whether it's a traditional workflow to getting your travel expenses approved, whether it's to finding a document by search, or collaborating on different things in your organization from a BlackBerry. And so we're looking at how we handle different devices down the line, but we clearly recognize that mobility is going to be a huge differentiator for vendors and how they approve solutions in that sense. We've seen that in the consumer space. I think every consumer startup has to, on the web, have their, their iPhone app emblazoned on the front of their, their masthead.
Yep.
But I think that it's quite relevant that mobility will be one of the main ways in which we access our data on the go in a very virtual workplace.
So for enterprises renewing their applications over the next couple of years, that making sure that they're accessible through mobile devices and they're selecting products and services that can be delivered to those devices sounds like the big tip from you.
Absolutely.
That concludes this episode of The Advisor. I'd like to again thank my guest, Cuneyt Uysal, Product Manager with OpenText for Asia Pacific. Thanks, Cuneyt. And I look forward to seeing you again next time on Longhouse TV.